clicking of my thumbs. Something wicked this way comes.
My son is a teenager now, but he'll occasionally ask if I remember when he saw the shadows in the glowing man. This all started when he was about 3. He'd start crying or yelling for me at night, and when I would check on him, he told me that there was a black watery swirl above his bed and it was scaring him. After a few times, he said there was a glowing man in the corner keeping the black water from hurting him. This went on for ages. By the time he was in early elementary, he was scared of the shadow man in the hallway that would look into his room at night. He described him as very tall, with the shape of a hat on his head and red eyes. One night he was spending the night with his cousin, and my brother and sister-in-law informed me that he was terrified of their hallway. He kept telling me the shadow man was there. I'd say he was 7 at the time. A friend of mine contacted someone for me and gave me a prayer, I guess that's what it was, to say with him in his room. Since then, he didn't mention it as much. I'm not particularly religious, so I thought it was bogus. But either way it worked, or my son is a prime example of placebo effect. Like I said, he will bring it up once in a while, but for the most part, it's in the past. He did Google shadow people and swears that's what the guy in the hallway was. I'd like to also add that my mum refused to sleep upstairs when she visited. Once, when she was asleep up there, she said she heard me coming up the stairs and then stopped outside of her bedroom door. She apparently called for me, but then started scolding me for scaring her. She got up to see, and I wasn't there. She went into my room and saw me and my husband sound asleep. This was probably 10 to 12 years ago. She maintained this story up until her dying breath. So a few years back, I had gone out with some friends to the mountains for a camping trip. And by camping, I mean everyone gets drunk or high around a fire in the middle of the woods and then passes out in their trucks. I was always the youngest of the friend group, and this took place before I found my taste for mind-altering substances. I'm typically something of a skeptic, and if this had happened nowadays, I'd probably blame it on being drunk. But I was stone cold sober the whole time, which is why I feel so sure of what I saw. We're all out at the campsite, maybe 10 to 15 of us. I'm sitting on someone's tailgate smoking a cigarette when my friend, let's call him John, comes up to me clearly intoxicated. John was the one I came out to the campsite with, and probably my closest friend out of anyone here. He asked me if I wanted to go on an adventure with him into the woods. I figured that, if nothing else, I should probably go with him just to make sure he didn't drunkenly fall over and hurt himself. Not to mention, even though I didn't drink or do any drugs back then, that didn't mean I was opposed to fun adventures into the forest. So we walked past the tree line that surrounded the campfire and into the dense trees. The moon was out, and it was a pretty clear night, so although it was dark, it wasn't pitch black. We came to a clearing that seemed to be made up of many flashish boulders and rocks. We were looking up at the night sky, and John was drunk talking, and I was listening and nodding along with whatever nonsense he was saying. He sat down on one of the flatter rocks and eventually just laid down and passed out. I tried to jostle him awake, but he just kept mumbling for me to let him have a rest for a while. Since this is usually how John behaves when he's drinking, I complied. I figured I'd head back to the campsite and check on him again in a little bit. I go back, talk to a few people, smoke a few cigarettes, then decided to go back and check on John. Maybe 10 minutes had passed. I'm walking back to the clearing where I left him, and already from afar I noticed that he wasn't in the spot that I left him. I kept going, figuring that he must have gotten up and wandered off somewhere. As I'm walking, I notice a shadow in the shape of a human standing behind a shrub of sorts, a few feet to my right. I stop, figuring that it was John messing with me. I said, "Dude, come on, let's head back to camp." And no response. Then, the stereotypical, "Please, you're not scaring me." and still nothing. I move closer to the shadow and notice that I can't make out any distinguishable features. No shirt logo, no eyes, or any face for that matter. Just a vacuum of black that stood in the shape of a human, hanging out with me in the forest. I backed away, putting it all together that it wasn't John, and I ran back to camp. I checked the truck that John and I drove out in, and there he was, sleeping on the bench seat. I did a quick head count, and everyone that I had recalled being at the camp was still there. The only thing that convinces me that this was paranormal was just the sheer absence of light that this thing took the shape of. Just pure darkness. Whenever I tell this story, John always gets the chills imagining that this thing was probably out there with him when he was passed out by himself. The general conclusion was that John had stumbled back while I had left him, and I just didn't notice that he had returned. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, so I always try to rationalize these things. But this is the one experience that I've had that I just can't believe was simply my eyes playing tricks on me. I've heard of shadow people, but I always thought those were just what people saw during sleep paralysis, not out in the wilderness and fully awake. If anyone could give me an idea of what this could have been, that'd be much appreciated. This experience I actually shared with an old friend of mine who was staying with me for a week. This didn't just happen to me, which actually made it a little less scary for me, since usually stuff would happen only when I was alone. My friend, who I will call Al for privacy, had come over during his vacation time from work and decided to stay with me. He was living in a different state at the time. He would visit with his family during the day, then come back to the apartment at night to sleep. Towards the middle of the week, I finally had the day off from work the next day, and we agreed to hang out that night. He picked me up at my job after work. This was around 10 p.m, and we picked up some takeout and drove to the small park in my apartment complex to eat. We walked over to one of the 2 picnic tables that were at this park. We were there for maybe an hour, just eating our food, reminiscing about old times and just joking around and having a good time. Suddenly, I felt some really heavy energy in the atmosphere. It was a familiar but still creepy as hell feeling. I kind of froze up and got really quiet and had the urge to get up and look around. I ignored what I was feeling and I stayed sitting at the table. Al was now giving me a funny look. He asked me if I was okay and I told him yes. I was starting to get used to this stuff just randomly happening, and I didn't want to make a big deal about it to my friend. I then felt like someone was staring at me from a distance, and I got chills up and down my arms. Apparently my friend had some sort of strange feeling too, because I saw him slightly jump up in his seat at the same time that I got this feeling. We looked at each other, and we were quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked me if I all of a sudden felt cold. I told him yes, I did, and then told him we should go back to the apartment. We got up and started picking up our trash. I walked away from the picnic table and went over to the trash bin, which was to my right, near the sidewalk. I turned around and I see my friend had stopped picking up his trash since he was answering a text message on his phone. Well, right behind him, on the second picnic table, was a shadow figure sitting at the table. I froze and was completely getting chills all over. I automatically assumed, because of my sensitivity to these things, that I was the only one who could see it. My friend then noticed that I was staring behind him, and he turned around. My friend then jumped back, dropping his phone in the process, and ran over to where I was, in a panic. I asked him in a whisper if he could see it, and he whispered back to me, "Holy shit, is that real?" I told him I could see it clear as day. We both froze up and stood there, super quiet, while this shadow just sat there, not moving at all. This figure had no discernible shape. It was not in the shape of a person or anything. It was just a round black shadow that only had shoulders and a head. As I was staring at it, I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach, and I started to pray silently in my head that this thing would go away. Suddenly, It just randomly vanished. I swear it must have been sitting there for almost the longest 2 to 3 minutes of my life. As soon as it vanished, we both ran straight to my friend's rental car, with him briefly stopping to grab his phone. Jumped into the car and locked the doors. Al started the car, and as he was starting to back up out of the parking space, we both heard 2 bangs on the hood of his car. We screamed, and he literally did almost a burnout as he drove away from the park area. He drove fast as hell to where my apartment building was, parked in the first guest parking he saw. We then both literally ran like hell straight to my apartment. Eventually, after a long while, we both managed to calm down and talk about what happened. I explained to him the stuff that has happened to me since I moved to the apartment. He was completely freaked out and told me to come stay with him at his family's house because he did not feel safe me staying there alone. I explained to him it didn't matter. This stuff happens to me all the time at random places, and it doesn't matter where I go. After a while of him trying to convince me, I agreed, and we stayed at his family's house for the rest of that week. Obviously, I had to come back to my apartment after he left. He felt really sympathetic towards me and was genuinely afraid for me. He still lives in another state and calls me every once in a while to check up on me. I, of course, avoided that little park in the apartment complex like the plague after that. So I used to live in a private house. It was a 3-family home, but it was shared with other families. I remember the home layout perfectly well. When you walk in through the door, you have the bathroom in front of you and the kitchen to your right. To your left is the large living room and the bedroom after that. The bedroom was small, but it was enough for my small family. It was me, my dad, and my mum. We weren't far from stores. There was like around 5 stores and 2 supermarkets. Father was at work doing security or EMS. I don't remember too much what he did. So it was me and my mother. She wanted to go to the market that day, and I was in the bedroom watching TV. We had a high-riser, a bed that goes under the other and pulls out when you're ready to sleep, leveling with the other bed. I was sitting on the bottom one when my mother comes into the room asking if I wanted to go with her or stay home. Of course, I chose to stay home because me, a kid, and TV. So my mother gives me the rundown of the rules of her leaving me alone in the house. No opening the door, do not leave the room, and just stay watching TV. Me and your father have the key. My mother leaves the house and I faithfully stay watching TV after watching her go out of view to the end of the block, which again wasn't far at all. Now I turn and watch TV. Suddenly the TV starts becoming messed up and I start messing around with the bunny ears to realize it's not working. I change the channels and it's all white noise. I hear something. My name. I'm thinking my mother is back and I walked to the bedroom door. I looked ahead and no one is there. My mother had not come back, so there should be no one in the house. I stay quiet though, in case someone was at the door. Again, I'm in the bedroom and I can see straight to the kitchen. I go back and stare at the TV that was no longer showing a picture but just static that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. But I was a kid, so I wasn't sure how TV worked. Again, I heard my name. I turned my head and looked to the bedroom door, staring at it. Hearing my name, I was rather shocked, since it wasn't my mother's voice and my dad wasn't home. Again, I heard my name and there were steps, but it wasn't what footsteps should sound like. It wasn't a pitter-pat of flat feet. It was a sound of hooves, like a horse, but slowly, with caution as if aware. Thonk was one step after my name was said. It wasn't a firm voice. It was more of a whispering call, as if luring someone. I stand up and walk again, slowly this time, towards the bedroom door and look out, looking straight ahead, towards the living room, the bathroom and the kitchen. I could see half the fridge as it was there, casting a shadow from the light that came from the window. Thonk thonk. The hoof noises happened again. and slowly the shadow of the fridge moves. I just thought someone was in the driveway moving around until I saw the shadow form. It was next to the fridge, and there was a shadowy figure, kinda skinny, the upper body slightly arched forward, the head shaped like a triangle with a sharp chin, and two long pointy things coming from the head. It looked like a person just standing there, but not physically. The bottom was of two legs, but the legs weren't straight. They were arched back, like an animal on hind legs. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I just stared at it. It stood still, but you could hear a horse slowly walking till it was starting to strut faster. My name whispered again as I stood in fear at the door for a split second before running into the room and hiding under the bed. I stayed there, hearing the hooves getting closer, but it was sounding like it was passing through the bathroom and just going through the living room. My name still being whispered. I started crying, not sure what was going on, and suddenly, just like that, you heard the keys to the door unlocking it. The hoofs stopped, the whispering died, and the TV was back to showing whatever show was on for that channel. When the door opened, I ran so fast and hugged the hell out of my mother. I cried so hard, and my mother thought someone did something to me, but I didn't know how to explain it. So I told her I was scared, and she said, "Well, I told you I was going to the supermarket, and you wanted to stay." That's all I was able to say to her when I didn't understand anything. This was my very first memory of my seeing and hearing of the paranormal. Years later, I've seen the depictions of how religions had seen the devil, and I saw it looked exactly like the image of the shadow that had first appeared itself to me. But by then, I had already seen so much, and admitting that you might have seen the devil at 6 years old wasn't really on my mind to tell anyone. But yes, my first paranormal experience was the shadow of the devil himself. I'll preface this by saying I've enjoyed reading the posts here lately, as I feel they confirm I'm not crazy. I've always had an interest in the supernatural, perhaps because I like a good scare, but also because it confirms what I already know, that there are unexplainable things out in this crazy world of ours. The events I will describe in this post occurred from between the ages of 9 to 19 when I moved out as soon as I could from my parents' home. I didn't move because I had disagreements or arguments with my parents. Aside from a few hormonal teenage years, for the most part we had a great relationship. I could talk about almost anything with my parents, and them me. I especially have a strong bond with my mother because my father worked hours away most of my life, and we would spend hours sharing our paranormal experiences with each other. I have no recollection of anything remotely paranormal until my family decided to move to a rural town in Georgia when I was around 9. Keep in mind, I had much fresher memories in the past, but it's been around 5 years since I moved out, and these experiences were a normal occurrence for 10 years of my life. I won't say they were ever routine, as I was always terrified of seeing the shadow people, but it became something I routinely expected and feared. Apologies for the long backstory, but I feel it better sets the stage for my post, and these encounters are something I've not shared aside from a few close friends and family. The first encounter I had with the shadow people was completely unexpected and completely caught me off guard. I was around 9 and helping my mum with laundry. It was midday and a normal sunny day. Totally not the setting for anything scary. The laundry room was off a main hallway that ran from 2 bedrooms in the back of the house, which contained my bedroom and my brother's bedroom, and led to the living room with the kitchen and dining room jutting off of it, as well as an extra entertainment room, eventually ending in my parents' room, which had its own master bathroom. I had a basket full of laundry, about to bring it to my mother so we could fold it, when, as I began to step into the main hallway, a black mass ran right in front of me. It was black and a blur. It seemed to run extremely fast in front of me and into the wall at the end of the hall. I was shaken up, but just explained it to my mum, who listened attentively and reassured me it probably was just my imagination. A few days later, I was brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed when I put my toothbrush down and turned only to find a black figure was staring at me. We were eye to eye, and I was petrified. It disappeared after a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I remember feeling an oppressive feeling in my room constantly. It was like, instinctively, I knew something was watching me. I remember playing hide and seek with my brother for maybe 20 minutes, max, before the feeling of being watched was just too much, and I'd give up and rejoin him, so I didn't feel as scared. I would hear my mother calling, and I would get up to answer her, and she would tell me she didn't call me and would laugh it off. I remember one night walking up to get a glass of water and seeing my brother. I called his name because I was feeling scared, and having a companion on this late night endeavor would be comforting. My brother just kept walking. I thought he didn't hear me, so I called his name again and reached out for his shoulder. He turned around, and it wasn't him. It looked identical, but it wasn't. I don't remember what set me off to the fact that it wasn't him. Maybe it was the eyes or the face. It was so long ago that I just remember it happening, and then it disappeared. I ran to our shared room where my brother was asleep. I confided in my mother, who mentioned that early in the mornings when she was making coffee and getting ready for our morning routine, she would occasionally hear the sounds of children playing and hiding, and would call out our names to no response. She was very supportive and firmly believed in the supernatural. The years that followed were full of short sightings of shadow people on and off. My mother and I would collaborate our stories. I had moved back into my old room, and my brother his by this point, and the oppressive feeling was just a part of life. My father even told stories of seeing a man in their room at night, but he was a very skeptical man and would only tell my mum vague details and then quickly state he didn't remember what she was talking about. We'd occasionally hear footsteps and what sounded like something heavy smashing into the back end of our house and see figures, but I feel like the shadow people either slowed down or my memories faded because the occurrences were so normal. That was until my memory of them resumes and is much worse. The shadow people I would see were much taller. My mum and I noted that perhaps they were in some sort of hibernation, soaking up negative emotions because the previous shadow people were more akin to the size of children. The oppressive feeling was back, and much worse. I began to have violent nightmares. I would dream of a black being on my ceiling attacking me, attacking my dog. I began to see the beings more regularly, and I eventually began sleeping on the couch in the living room and almost completely avoided my old room. But this did not stop the feelings of being watched and the nightmares. I vividly remember walking up drenched in sweat and gasping for air after one particularly vivid nightmare, where the black being was above me, sucking what I presumed to be my life essence out of me. I lived my life at home in constant fear. I avoided my home as much as I could. I suffered from horrible insomnia. Eventually we cleansed the house. At first we tried sage, but that only seemed to anger the shadow people more. They lashed out harder. So we had a priest provide us with holy water and holy oil. I felt that I would have to be the one to cleanse our home, as I was the main focus. My family saw the beings on occasion, and I don't think my brother saw them at all. So I proceeded to cleanse the house. Things were quiet after I did the cleansing, until one night when I had a new nightmare. I dreamt of a completely burnt man. I could make out every horrible detail in his burnt flesh. He still had his eyes and teeth, and he was just staring at me and smiling a creepy grin. I woke up mortified, but I interpreted the dream as more of a, I have to leave now, but I'm not finished with you. Apologies for the long rambling post, but I thought I'd share. My family home was built when we moved. Before we moved in, the land was covered in trees and my family purchased 30 acres of woods and creek to build their house, aside from a small house next door that came with the purchase. We stayed there while we waited for the land to be cleared and a home to be moved there. My dad stated a man was murdered in the first home because he was in with some shady characters, but aside from news articles and town gossip, we never actually found out much. I should mention, there was no activity at the other house aside from some creepy vibes, and sometimes after it was left vacant, or when I'd get home from school, I heard voices inside and out, but couldn't make out words. It sounded like a male and female talking, but they'd be quiet as soon as I started making noise in the house. Also, my mum would have strange dreams, but they weren't malevolent. On one occasion, she mentioned she had dreamt of a young boy who was dead and buried at the back end of our home.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.